In the late 1950s, a new sleeping pill arrived on pharmacy shelves. The advertisements showed birds feeding their young, and the slogan promised that the drug could be given with complete safety to pregnant women and nursing mothers. It was called Distaval in Britain, Contergan in Germany, Kevadon in the United States. The pill did not taste like medicine. It had no immediate side effects. It seemed so gentle, so unobtrusive, that doctors called it harmless. And then the children began to be born without arms. This is the deep archive. We leave the surface now. The hatch seals. Pressure builds as we descend past the calm statistics and into the submerged rooms where the evidence waits. A pediatric ward in December 1961. The smell of antiseptic and wool blankets. A rubber stamp hitting a rejection letter in a cramped FDA office. A London courtroom where a prosthetic limb taps against marble while lawyers debate a Latin phrase. Below the dark water, the files open. The sleeping pill that promised silence left a scar shaped like a pregnant woman with a red diagonal line, a symbol it created, a warning it could not wear in time. The descent begins. The sound of glass beakers clinking in a darkened laboratory, the low hum of a centrifuge winding down, and the unexpected quiet of caged rats that should have been scrambling, but instead sat motionless, breathing slowly under dim fluorescent light. This is where the story begins, not with a scream, not with a catastrophe, but with an absence of sound. The rats were not dead. They were not sedated in the way that laboratory animals are supposed to be sedated, with a chemical clumsiness that makes them stagger and drool. They were simply still, calm, difficult to startle. And that stillness, observed by a man who had already learned to measure human life in sacrificable units, would become the quiet engine of one of the most haunting pharmaceutical disasters of the 20th century. In 1954, Chemie Grünenthal was a small German chemical company working out of a converted factory in Stolberg, near the Belgian border. The war had ended less than a decade earlier, and the post-war pharmaceutical market was a scramble. Antibiotics were the future. Penicillin, streptomycin, tetracycline, and Grünenthal wanted a piece of that future. Their researchers were attempting to develop a cheaper method for producing peptide-based antibiotics from existing waste compounds. Peptides are short chains of amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, and the waste from other industrial processes seemed like a promising raw material. They synthesized a new compound, tested it against bacteria, and found nothing. No antibacterial activity, no antifungal activity, no antiparasitic activity. The chemical did nothing to any pathogen they could grow in a dish. The compound was thalidomide, and by every measure of mid-century pharmaceutical screening, it was useless. Grünenthal nearly abandoned it. The bottles sat on a shelf, labeled and forgotten, but the company had a physician on staff named Dr. Heinrich Muchter, and Muchter had a habit of looking at failures differently. He had come to Grünenthal through a door that most German companies preferred to keep closed. During the war, Muchter had conducted typhus vaccine experiments on concentration camp prisoners at the Roswithow facility in occupied Poland. He had used human beings as culture medium, injecting them with pathogens and observing what died. After the war, he was never prosecuted. He simply moved into the pharmaceutical industry, as many of his colleagues did, carrying his methods in a leather briefcase and his ethics in a shallow grave. Muchter noticed the rats. The thalidomide did not kill them. It did not make them sick. It made them quiet. In a laboratory filled with the nervous rustling of rodents, the thalidomide cage was a pocket of artificial peace. Muchter pushed the compound forward, not because he understood how it worked, he did not, but because he recognized a commercial opportunity. A sedative that did not cause the morning hangover of barbiturates, did not suppress breathing dangerously, did not produce the agitated confusion of other tranquilizers. A sedative that seemed to do nothing except make the animal world slow down and exhale. The German regulatory system of the 1950s was not designed to catch a drug like thalidomide. The law required only one thing: proof that the drug did not cause acute poisoning in animals, not evidence of efficacy, not safety studies in pregnancy, not long-term toxicity data. If you could show that a rat did not drop dead immediately after swallowing a dose, you could bring your product to market. On July 1, 1957, thalidomide was approved for over-the-counter sale in West Germany under the brand name Contergan. No prescription required, no warning labels. No question about what it might do to a human fetus, because no one had asked that question, and the law did not require anyone to ask it. Here is the paradox that sits at the center of this chapter. A drug developed from antibiotic waste, with no medicinal value against infection, became celebrated as the safest sedative precisely because it did nothing except induce sleep. Its emptiness was marketed as its virtue. The advertising campaigns called it harmless. Physicians prescribed it for anxiety, for insomnia, for the coughs of children, for the agitation of the elderly. And because it tasted like nothing and had no immediate side effects, patients believed the marketing. The drug was so gentle, so unobtrusive, that it seemed almost elegant, a molecule with perfect manners. But the archive does not forgive manners. The archive asks what the molecule was doing while everyone was watching it do nothing. The quiet rats in the 1954 laboratory were not merely calm. They were receiving a chemical instruction that would take years to translate. Thalidomide binds to a protein called cereblon, which regulates the activity of other proteins involved in limb development and blood vessel formation. In adult rats, this binding produces a gentle sedation. In a human embryo during a specific 36-day window, between the 34th and 50th day after the last menstrual period, that same binding disrupts the growth of the long bones in arms and legs. The cells that should become humeri and radii and tibiae simply stop. The hands and feet develop anyway, but they attach directly to the torso. The Greek word for this is phocomelos, seal limb, phocomelia. None of this was known in 1957. The mechanism was invisible. The timing was invisible. The consequence was invisible for 9 months. So the bottles went out. Pharmacies stacked them on shelves. Pregnant women with morning sickness took them before breakfast, grateful for a pill that promised sleep without punishment. And the molecule, indifferent as a ledger, began keeping its own accounts. The story of thalidomide is not a story of monsters. Dr. Heinrich Muchter was not a cartoon villain. He was a man who had learned to see human bodies as experimental substrates, and he carried that education into peacetime industry. The German regulators were not corrupt. They were operating under laws written before anyone thought to ask whether a sedative might be a sculptor of human form. The chemists who synthesized thalidomide from waste compounds were not trying to hurt anyone. They were trying to find an antibiotic, and they found something else entirely. But the bill will come due. And in the case of thalidomide, the bill would arrive not in a courtroom or a laboratory, but in the delivery rooms of 46 countries, where midwives and obstetricians would look at the children in their hands and see something that had no name yet. The quiet rats had spoken. It would take 4 more years for anyone to listen. A pediatric ward in early December 1961. The smell of antiseptic cuts through the air, mixed with the faint lanolin of wool blankets pulled up to small chins. The radiators click and sigh. And there is a stillness that does not belong to any healthy nursery, a row of cribs where infants with shortened limbs cannot lift their heads to cry for attention. They turn their faces toward the window light instead, silently, because the muscles of their necks are present, but the arms that would push against a mattress are not shaped the way arms should be. The nurses call them seal children. The medical charts say phocomelia, from the Greek phoke for seal and melos for limb. The parents say nothing at all. Between 1957 and 1961, an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 children were born with thalidomide-induced embryopathy across 46 countries. The range of the estimate, a full 10,000 lives of uncertainty, reflects how poorly the disaster was documented in real time. No central registry, no global reporting requirement, just obstetricians in Hamburg and Melbourne and Stockholm and Toronto, looking at the delivery table and reaching for a pen to write down something they had never seen before. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew to look. The long bones of arms and legs simply missing, hands and feet attached directly to the torso like flowers without stems. Some children had only one affected limb, some had 4. Some had additional damage to ears, eyes, hearts, digestive tracts. But the visual signature of thalidomide, the image that would eventually appear on newspaper front pages around the world, was the seal limb. The strange part was not that the drug caused harm. The strange part was the precision of its cruelty. Thalidomide causes damage only during a precise 36-day window of pregnancy, between days 34 and 50 after the last menstrual period. Before that window, the developing limb buds have not yet begun the rapid cell division that makes them vulnerable. After that window, the basic structure of arms and legs has already been laid down, and the drug passes through without permanent effect. But inside those 36 days, the embryo is building its limbs at an extraordinary pace. Mesenchymal cells proliferating, blood vessels forming to supply the new tissue, a cascade of genetic instructions unfolding like a folded map. A single dose of thalidomide taken on day 38 might affect only the upper limbs. The same dose taken on day 45, when the lower limbs are in their critical phase, might affect only the legs. The drug did not attack randomly. It attacked exactly what was being built at the moment it arrived. This is the paradox that the quiet spring of 1961 would reveal. The same chemical property that made thalidomide appear harmless in standard safety tests, its poor solubility and slow absorption, meaning it passed through the guts of laboratory rats without causing immediate toxicity, allowed it to cross the human placental barrier in concentrations sufficient to sculpt human malformations. Rats metabolize thalidomide differently than humans do. Rabbits do too. The animal tests that had satisfied German regulators showed no birth defects because the animals used did not sustain high enough blood levels of the drug for long enough. In a pregnant woman, the drug lingered, it accumulated, and it crossed the placenta as if the barrier were a suggestion rather than a wall. The first person to suspect the link was Dr. William McBride, an Australian obstetrician practicing in Sydney. He had prescribed thalidomide as a morning sickness treatment to hundreds of his patients. It worked beautifully. Women who had been vomiting every morning could suddenly keep down toast and tea. But in March 1961, McBride noticed that 3 women who gave birth to children with phocomelia had all used the drug. He noted the correlation in his records. Then he did nothing with the observation for 8 months. He continued prescribing thalidomide. He did not publish a letter in The Lancet until December, after the story had already broken elsewhere. The medical establishment would later debate whether McBride was slow or simply cautious. The mothers of the children born between March and December 1961, who might have been spared if he had spoken earlier, did not participate in the debate. The man who actually broke the story was Dr. Widukind Lenz, a German pediatrician working at the University Hospital in Hamburg. In November 1961, a mother brought her phocomelia child to his clinic. During the consultation, she mentioned that she still had leftover Contergan, the German brand name for thalidomide, in her medicine cabinet. She had taken it for morning sickness. Lenz asked her to bring the bottle. Then he began asking every parent who walked through his door the same question. Did you take Contergan during pregnancy? He interviewed more than 200 affected families in 2 weeks. 80% said yes. He did not wait for statistical validation. He did not wait for a colleague to confirm. On November 18, 1961, he telephoned Chemie Grünenthal directly and told them to withdraw the drug immediately. The company refused, so Lenz went to the press. The German news magazine Der Spiegel ran the story on November 29, 1961. Within days, Contergan was pulled from pharmacy shelves across West Germany. Other countries followed, but by then the damage was already distributed. The drug had been on the market for 4 years and 4 months. Enough bottles had been sold to fill a warehouse. Enough women had taken a tablet after breakfast, believing the advertisements that promised safety for mother and child, that the quiet spring had already become a quiet autumn in delivery rooms from Cologne to Cape Town. The bills would not be itemized until later. The lawsuits, the compensation funds, the regulatory reforms, those belonged to another chapter. What belonged to December 1961 was the stillness, the cribs, the smell of antiseptic and wool, the faces of infants who could not lift their arms to wave at the ceiling, who could only turn toward the window light and wait for someone to notice that a treaty signed in the blood had just been broken by a molecule that was never supposed to cross any border at all. The distinct thud of a rubber stamp hitting a rejection letter in a cramped FDA office in the autumn of 1960. The scratch of a fountain pen circling missing data points. And through the window, the sound of a Washington, D.C. street where pregnant women walk past, unaware of the invisible door that has just closed behind them. The woman at the desk is Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey, and she has just done something that will save an estimated 10,000 American children from phocomelia. She has not discovered a new drug. She has not performed an emergency surgery. She has simply stamped a piece of paper with the word "denied." Kelsey was not looking for a scandal when she joined the Food and Drug Administration in 1960. She was 45 years old, a pharmacologist trained at the University of Chicago, and she had spent the previous decade studying the safety of over-the-counter medications. Her early research had focused on how drugs cross the placenta, specifically how quinine, used to treat malaria, passes from maternal circulation into fetal blood. She knew what many of her colleagues still refused to accept, that the placenta was not a fortress. Molecules small enough could slip through, and thalidomide was very small. In 1958, the William S. Merrill Company, a Cincinnati-based pharmaceutical firm, acquired the United States rights to thalidomide from Chemie Grünenthal. Merrill saw a blockbuster. The German data showed a sedative that produced no barbiturate hangover, no respiratory depression, no addiction potential. It seemed too good to be true. Merrill submitted an application to the FDA for market approval under the brand name Kevadon. The application landed on Kelsey's desk in August 1960. She read it carefully. That was her job. But reading carefully in the FDA of 1960 was not the default behavior. The agency had fewer than 200 medical officers to review thousands of applications each year. Most approvals were granted automatically, unless something glaring appeared. Kelsey, however, had been trained by Eugene Geeling, a pharmacologist who insisted that animal studies be thorough, that data be verifiable, that safety be demonstrated rather than asserted. She brought that training into every folder she opened. The thalidomide application troubled her, not because she suspected birth defects, no one did yet, but because the application was incomplete. Grünenthal's animal studies were poorly documented. Some of the data seemed to come from experiments that had not been properly controlled. The drug had been shown to cause peripheral neuropathy, nerve damage, in some patients, and Kelsey wanted to understand why. She also noticed that the safety studies had not been conducted on pregnant animals. No one at Grünenthal had asked what thalidomide might do to a fetus. Kelsey asked. On September 12, 1960, she stamped the application not approved and sent it back to Merrill with a list of questions. What followed was 19 months of pressure. Merrill representatives visited the FDA headquarters repeatedly. They wrote letters accusing Kelsey of obstruction. They called her supervisors, demanding that she be overruled. At one point, they argued that Germany had already approved Contergan for over-the-counter sale, and that American women were being denied a breakthrough treatment for morning sickness and insomnia. The argument was not new. Merrill had used the same technique with other drugs, pointing to foreign approvals as proof of safety, and it had worked. The FDA had previously accepted such reasoning, but Kelsey held. She was not being heroic in the way that movies understand heroism. She was not staring down a villain or risking her career. She was simply refusing to say yes until she had answers. The distinction matters. Kelsey later said that she did not think of herself as brave. She thought of herself as thorough. And thoroughness, in a regulatory system designed to prioritize speed over scrutiny, was a kind of insubordination. The danger was not hidden in the poison. It was hidden in the dosage and in the timing. Kelsey did not know about the 36-day window of embryonic vulnerability. No one did. But she knew that Merrill had not done the studies that would have revealed it. She asked for longer-term safety data. She asked for animal studies that included pregnant subjects. She asked for evidence that the drug did not accumulate in fetal tissue. Merrill could not provide any of it because Grünenthal had never collected it. Meanwhile, under a relaxed investigational drug policy that required only that a physician submit a form to the FDA, Merrill had distributed approximately 2.5 million tablets of thalidomide to over 1,200 American physicians for clinical trial use. The policy was intended to encourage innovation, to allow experimental drugs to reach patients before full approval. In practice, it was a loophole large enough to drive a pharmaceutical truck through. By November 1961, when the news broke from Germany, Merrill had covered approximately 20,000 American patients with thalidomide, including an unknown number of pregnant women. Some of those women gave birth to children with phocomelia. The exact number has never been determined. The door nearly opened. If Kelsey had approved the application in September 1960, thalidomide would have been on American pharmacy shelves by Christmas of that year. The marketing campaign was already written. The samples were already packed. The advertisements, which would have shown smiling pregnant women holding bottles of Kevadon, were already printed. For 19 months, Merrill waited for Kelsey to relent. She did not. The paradox is quiet, but absolute. A woman whose job was to evaluate other people's scientific data saved an estimated 10,000 American children from phocomelia, not through any new discovery or heroic action, but simply by doing her job carefully, asking for more information before saying yes. She did not invent a test. She did not cure a disease. She read a file and found it wanting. And because she read carefully, the door remained closed. On the street outside the FDA office, the pregnant women walked past in the autumn light. They did not know that a rubber stamp had just negotiated a treaty on their behalf. They did not know that a fountain pen had drawn a circle around missing numbers, and that those missing numbers were the difference between a child with arms and a child without. The discovery did not end the story. It made the story portable. And Frances Kelsey, who would later receive the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service from John F. Kennedy, understood that the real work was not the stamping, but the waiting, the refusal to be rushed, the willingness to let silence accumulate until the evidence spoke. A London courtroom in the winter of 1973. The smell of tea and old wood hangs in the air, trapped beneath high ceilings and behind oak panels polished by decades of nervous palms. Solicitors whisper to one another, shuffling papers that have been folded and unfolded so many times the corners have softened to felt. And then there is the sound that stops every conversation, a single prosthetic limb tapping against a marble floor as a child leaves the room. The lawyers do not look up. They have learned not to look. Outside, the photographers wait. Inside, they discuss whether the word ex gratia means what they all know it means. The British pharmaceutical company Distillers Company, later known as Distillers Biochemicals, a subsidiary of the whiskey giant, had entered the thalidomide market with confidence. They distributed the drug under the brand name Distaval, and their advertising campaign showed birds feeding their young. Accompanied by the slogan, "Distaval can be given with complete safety to pregnant women and nursing mothers without any adverse effect on mother or child." The image of a mother bird bringing food to an open-beaked chick was meant to evoke nurture, protection, the natural order. It was a photograph of trust, and like so many photographs from that era, it concealed the negative. By 1968, 7 years after thalidomide was withdrawn, the families of 369 British children with thalidomide deformities had banded together to sue distillers. The children were now school-aged. Some had learned to write with their feet. Others had been fitted with prosthetic arms that cost more than their fathers earned in a year. They wanted compensation. They wanted an admission. They wanted the company that had advertised a drug as completely safe for pregnant women to say, in a court of record, that they had been wrong. The case dragged through the British legal system for 5 years. Distillers did not deny that thalidomide caused the injuries. The science was too clear, the pattern too unmistakable. Instead, the company fought on procedure, on causation, on the statute of limitations. They argued that the drug had been approved by the British regulatory authorities, such as they were in 1958, and that they had acted in good faith. The families argued that good faith did not excuse an advertisement showing a mother bird. In 1973, distillers offered a settlement of approximately £20 million. That sum, divided among 369 children, came to roughly £54,000 each, about $130,000 at the time. It was not nothing. But it came with a condition that the families found almost as bitter as the drug itself. The payment would be made ex gratia, a Latin phrase meaning out of grace or as a favor. In legal terms, an ex gratia payment is not an admission of liability, it is a gift. Distillers would pay, but they would not say they were paying because they had done something wrong. The families could take the money, or they could continue to fight for another 5 years, another 10, with no guarantee of a different outcome. Most took the money. The lawyers packed their briefcases, and the word ex gratia entered the vocabulary of British pharmaceutical litigation as a door that could be closed without ever being unlocked. The reckoning was not only in the courts, it was also in the legislatures. On October 10, 1962, President John F. Kennedy signed the Kefauver-Harris Amendment into United States law. The amendment, named for Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee and Representative Orrin Harris of Arkansas, did what no federal drug law had done before. It required manufacturers to prove efficacy as well as safety before the FDA could grant approval. It mandated informed consent from clinical trial participants, meaning that doctors had to tell patients they were receiving an experimental drug. And it gave the FDA 60 days to review investigational new drug applications, replacing the old system in which applications were automatically approved unless an officer objected. The amendment was a direct response to the Thalidomide disaster and to the near miss that Francis Kelsey had engineered. It turned the FDA from a passive recipient of industry data into an active gatekeeper. The door that Kelsey had held shut with her rubber stamp was now reinforced with steel. But the reckoning was uneven. In Germany, where Contergan had been invented and approved, the legal consequences were almost invisible. Chemie Grünenthal never faced criminal prosecution. No executive went to prison. In 1973, the same year, the British families accepted their ex gratia settlement. The German government passed a compensation law that provided one-time payments to thalidomide victims ranging from 2,500 to 12,000 Deutschmarks, approximately $1,000 to $5,000. Survivors described the amount as less than the cost of a single prosthetic limb. A child who would need new prosthetics every few years as they grew received a payment that covered perhaps 2 fittings. The rest would come from charity, from family savings, from the quiet economies of endurance. And then there was the medal. In 1974, Chemie Grünenthal's chairman, Hermann Wirtz, received the German Federal Cross of Merit, the Bundesverdienstkreuz, for his industrial contributions. The award is one of Germany's highest civilian honors. It is given to individuals who have made exceptional contributions to the nation's political, economic, social, or intellectual life. Wirtz received it for building a pharmaceutical company that created jobs, exported products, and helped rebuild the German economy after the war. The children whose limbs had been sculpted by his company's drug were not mentioned in the citation. The medal hangs somewhere still. The paradox is quiet, like the tapping of a prosthetic limb on a marble floor. The first major pharmaceutical disaster of the modern era produced sweeping new drug safety laws in the United States and the United Kingdom. The Kefauver-Harris Amendment alone has saved countless lives by requiring rigorous testing before approval. Informed consent is now a standard part of clinical research. The FDA reviews applications with a scrutiny that did not exist in 1960. But the companies that distributed thalidomide never admitted wrongdoing in court. Distillers' payment was ex gratia, a gift, not a confession. Grünenthal paid into a compensation fund without accepting liability. And many of the executives who had pushed the drug onto the market, who had dismissed the first reports of phocomelia as statistical noise, retired with honors. Their reputations remained intact. The medals stayed on their lapels. The record shows a reform. The margin shows a cost. The lawyers in the London courtroom knew what ex gratia meant. It meant that the company would write a check, but not a confession. It meant that the children would receive money, but the company would retain the right to say, in future prospectuses and annual reports, that they had never been found liable. The marble floor did not care about Latin. The prosthetic limb tapped anyway, a metronome counting out the seconds until the next case, the next disaster, the next moment when the law would be asked to catch up with what chemistry had already done. A hospital pharmacy in the present. The soft beep of monitoring equipment drifts in from the corridor, a pulse that belongs to no single patient, but to the building itself. The quiet crinkle of a blister pack being opened for a multiple myeloma patient's evening dose. And on the same shelf, a faded warning label shaped like a pregnant woman with a diagonal red line across her silhouette, the symbol thalidomide created. The drug is back. It never really left. And the sleep that was supposed to end in 1961 has turned out to be the sleep that would not end. By 1965, the world had agreed to forget thalidomide. The drug had been withdrawn. The lawsuits were grinding forward. The children born with phocomelia were learning to write with their toes. And the bottles of Contergan, Distaval, Kevadon, those millions of tablets that had promised silence and delivered something else, sat in the back shelves of pharmacies, expired and unwanted. But in Jerusalem, at the Hadassah Hospital, a dermatologist named Dr. Jacob Sheskin had not thrown his old stock away. He kept it in a cabinet, labeled and dusty, because he could not bring himself to discard a chemical without understanding what it did. Sheskin was treating leprosy patients, not the leprosy of biblical imagery, the falling fingers and collapsing noses, but a complication of the disease called erythema nodosum leprosum. The condition produced painful, inflamed skin lesions that burned like cigarette burns scattered across the body. Patients could not sleep. The lesions came in waves, each wave worse than the last. Sheskin had tried steroids, antibiotics, anti-inflammatories. Nothing worked consistently. One night, a patient lay awake in agony, and Sheskin, desperate, remembered the old thalidomide bottles. He gave the man a tablet as a sedative, not expecting any effect on the lesions, just hoping to help him sleep. The next morning, the lesions were gone, not faded, not improved, gone. Sheskin repeated the experiment on more patients. The results were the same. Thalidomide, the monster of obstetrics, was a miracle for leprosy. He published his findings, and the medical world faced a question it did not want to answer. Could a drug that had caused so much suffering also relieve it? The answer, learned over decades, was yes. Thalidomide suppresses tumor necrosis factor, alpha, a signaling protein that drives inflammation. It inhibits angiogenesis, the growth of new blood vessels that feed both cancer and leprosy lesions. And it binds to that protein called cereblon, the same binding that disrupts limb development in embryos, but in adults, produces a cascade of anti-inflammatory and anti-cancer effects. The mechanism, finally understood in the 1990s, explained everything. The same molecule that tells embryonic limb cells to stop growing tells adult inflammatory cells to stop attacking. The drug had not changed. It had no intention, no morality, no memory of the children it had shaped. It simply was. And medicine, having spent a decade trying to bury it, had to learn to use it without repeating the catastrophe. In 1998, the FDA approved thalidomide for the treatment of erythema nodosum leprosum. The approval came with restrictions unprecedented in pharmaceutical history. No female patient could receive the drug without a negative pregnancy test. No female patient of reproductive age could receive it without using 2 forms of contraception simultaneously. Male patients had to use condoms because thalidomide can be present in semen. Doctors had to enroll in a risk management program. Patients had to sign consent forms acknowledging the teratogenic risk, and pharmacies had to keep the drug under lock with a separate inventory. The system was called STEPS, the System for Thalidomide Education and Prescribing Safety. It turned every prescription into a negotiation between relief and memory. Then came multiple myeloma. In 2006, the FDA approved thalidomide for this cancer of plasma cells, which causes bone destruction, kidney failure, and death. Combined with other drugs, thalidomide extended survival by years. Annual global sales exceeded $500 million. The drug that had bankrupted no one, Grünenthal, survived, prospered, paid its executives bonuses, was now a blockbuster. And on the same pharmacy shelves where it sat, the warning label showed a pregnant woman with a red diagonal line. The symbol did not exist before thalidomide. After thalidomide, it became universal. But the archive does not close neatly. In 2010, 62 years after thalidomide first entered the market, 49 years after it was withdrawn, the last known victim was born. In São Luís, Brazil, a pregnant woman with leprosy received thalidomide through a loophole in the public health system. The drug was still available for leprosy treatment. The distribution channels, despite all the restrictions, had a gap. A mislabeled medication, a missed pregnancy test, a child born with phocomelia, hands attached to shoulders, feet to hips. The same pattern, the same molecule, the same silence. The paradox that closes this story is not a resolution. It is a knot. A pharmaceutical weapon that destroyed the limbs of 10,000 children now extends the lives of cancer patients and leprosy sufferers, not because the drug changed, but because medicine learned, at terrible cost, that danger and benefit are not opposites, but twins separated only by context. Thalidomide is not a villain. It is a molecule. It does what molecules do. The villain, if there is one, is the gap between what we know and what we do with what we know. The 1950s did not know. The 1970s knew, but did not prosecute. The 2000s knew and built walls of regulation around the drug, but a child was still born in Brazil in 2010. The hospital pharmacy beeps softly. The blister pack crinkles. The warning label fades but does not disappear. The sleeping pill woke the world, but the world did not stay awake. It nodded off again, trusting that the next drug, the next discovery, the next promise of silence would be different. The archive suggests otherwise. It suggests that every molecule is a door, and every door opens both ways. The symbol of the pregnant woman with the red line is not a victory. It is a scar. And scars are not the end of a story. They are the place where the story becomes readable. The descent has ended. What becomes visible in the archive's dim light is this: the danger was never hidden in the poison alone. It was hidden in the gap between what we knew and what we chose to do with what we knew. The quiet rats in the 1954 laboratory, breathing slowly under fluorescent light. The rubber stamp falling on a Washington desk, circling missing data points. The prosthetic limb tapping against a London marble floor while lawyers debated Latin. The faded warning label shaped like a pregnant woman with a red diagonal line, a symbol that did not exist before thalidomide, and that now sits on pharmacy shelves beside the same molecule that carved the limbs of 10,000 children. The archive does not offer a clean resolution. It offers a scar. And scars are not endings. They are places where the story becomes readable. The pressure on the hull begins to ease. The black water turns to deep blue, then to green, then to the gray light of the surface. The hatch opens and cold sea air floods the chamber. The file closes, but the evidence does not sink again. It stays with us. A child born in Brazil in 2010, 62 years after the drug first entered the market. The sleeping pill woke the world, but the world nodded off. The lesson is not to seek the molecule. The lesson is to understand the shadow it left. If this kind of quiet descent into science and history is what you came for, you can subscribe to the Deep Archive. The surface returns. The archive seals. The scar remains readable.